Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules, especially just coming back from a holiday weekend to join us today. I'd also like to thank and welcome those who are joining us watching this discussion online. My name is Peter Pham. I'm the Vice President for Research and Regional Initiatives here at the Atlantic Council, as well as Director of the Africa Center. And I'm delighted to be here today for this launch of the Africa Center's newest report, Forging a New Era in U.S.-South African Relations by Tony Carroll. I'll turn the microphone over to Tony in just a moment. But before I do so, permit me to say a few words about the Africa Center and our growing body of work on the U.S.-South Africa relationship, as well as our continuing work on the U.S.-African relation writ large. The Africa Center was founded in 2009 by General James Jones with a mission to promote dynamic geopolitical partnerships with African states and to help shape U.S. and European policy priorities with respect to Africa toward strengthening security and promoting economic growth and prosperity on the continent. And certainly within that mandate, South Africa plays a critical role, having long been described as a strategic partner for the United States in Africa, but the fact is the relationship, if we're honest, has taken a lower profile in recent years. Instead, Washington has focused its attention and its resources on counterterrorism efforts across the Maghreb, Sahel, and the Horn of Africa, as well as other priorities. And despite South Africa's potential, U.S. investors have looked elsewhere on the continent for ripe areas for investment as the fumes of corruption scandals and economic stagnation have plagued the recent years of President Jacob Zuma's administration. And as a result of the confluence of factors, the U.S.-South African commercial diplomatic relationship has, quite frankly, grown a bit stale, with to the significant detriment and disadvantage of both countries, and a number of missed economic, political, and security cooperation opportunities. That's why Tony's report, copies of which were outside, and some of you have picked them up already. We look at this as not an end, but really the beginning of a body of work. And this particular report is not intended to give all the answers, but rather it's directed at a very particular audience, particularly here inside the Beltway in particular, but in the United States in general, toward the policy and business community, seeking to lay out some of the major issues that continue to block improved diplomatic and commercial ties between the United States and South Africa. Thus, the report is to be understood as the beginning of what we hope to be a substantial program of work on the U.S.-South African relationship. As such, it raises a number of questions, the answers to which we hope to explore in the coming years. Unfortunately, His Excellency Ambassador M.J. Malangu, the Ambassador of South Africa, was unable to join us today due to a conflict. We had hoped to have his response to this, but we look forward to engaging him and appreciate his openness and support of what we're doing. But we brought together a distinguished panel to discuss these issues and explore how the U.S. and South Africa can pursue a more robust and mutually beneficial relationship. Of course, I'll turn the floor over very quickly to Mr. Anthony Carroll. Tony Carroll is the author of the report, a lawyer, investor, and international affairs consultant with over 35 years' experience working on U.S. African economic and political issues, and served for a number of years on the U.S. South African Business Council. We're also very pleased to have with us Rob Eloff, managing partner at Lateral Capital, an African venture capital firm focused on early-stage technology ventures in sub-Saharan Africa. Rob is a South African and brings years of experience investing and living in developing and frontier markets to today's discussion. Very honored to have Ambassador Don Gips joining us from 2009 until 2013. Ambassador Gibbs served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of South Africa and is now a principal at the Albright Stonebridge Group, where he leads the group's robust Africa practice. And finally, to moderate the discussion, we have Aubrey Hruby, Senior Fellow in the Africa Center here. In her career advising Fortune 500 companies and U.S. and non-U.S. government agencies on how best to invest in Africa, she's helped facilitate more than $2 billion in investment capital flows to the continent. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Tony Carroll to present his report. Tony.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Tony.
Good to see you all, and many of some of my closest friends in the audience. Thanks for coming out today, and hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Council for providing me with the opportunity to undertake this study. I'd like to thank Peter, Kelsey, Johnny Gass, and especially my fellow Motswana, Bronwyn Bruton, for shepherding this report through the Council's rigorous editing and fact-checking process. However, if there are any inaccuracies in the report, they're my sole responsibility. I have been enmeshed in the evolution of South Africa since my arrival in neighboring Botswana as a Peace Corps volunteer in 1976. I was able to bear witness at the beginning of the end of the racist and statist apartheid regime starting in June '76 when I was staying in Hillbrow during the Orlando West riots in Soweto. In these past 41 years, my career as a commercial lawyer, development and business consultant, and academic have revolved in an orbit with South Africa at the center. This path has seen highs and lows, from the release of Nelson Mandela from prison to the killings in KwaZulu-Natal, from the passage of the world's most advanced constitution and a cabinet filled with struggle heroes to state capture, the Guptas, and aberrant governance as evidenced by the recent needless deaths of hundreds of disabled residents in a provincial hospital in Gauteng. My report addresses these highs and lows in greater detail. Kenako, it's a Swana term for it's time. It's time for a reset with our relationship with South Africa. The ANC's 54th elective Congress next month will establish the roadmap that not only for the identification of the party's candidate for the 2019 election, but also for the direction of a party that has been mired in a cavalcade of indiscretion and misrule that has defined the presidency of Jacob Zuma. The U.S. is starting from behind. In this decade alone, we have seen China's trade relationship with South Africa and Africa grow exponentially. And this presence is not only measured in trade volumes. For example, a recent study revealed that there are over 10,000 Chinese enterprises working across Africa. 89% of these are private entities and 90% of their employees are Africans. The U.S. Embassy, in contrast, proudly notes that there are 600 companies, U.S. companies with operations in South Africa. With regards to Europe, South Africa is in its third year of an economic partnership agreement with the European Union, an agreement that provides bilateral and symmetrical market access. U.S. exporters still confront tariffs and other trade barriers, whereas our European partners, or competitors, often who build upon traditional relationships, do not. Last, the Zuma presidency has embarked upon a close political and economic relationship with Russia centered on a $76 billion proposed nuclear energy program. Fellow BRICS of India and Brazil have also advanced their positions, along with new entrants such as Turkey, Iran, and the Emirates. Despite dysfunctional governance across all levels and competition from traditional and non-traditional actors, this reset with South Africa can build upon some unusual strengths that South Africa affords, certainly versus other emerging economies. Among these include capital markets. South Africa has the fourth oldest stock exchange in the world and has fostered an array of instruments suited to the needs of Africa's emerging economies, including a junior exchange and a social investment index. As evidenced by recent listings of Oyando from Nigeria and Chappies of Botswana, South Africa can serve as a capital market center for Africa. Market sophistication. No African country offers the level of market sophistication that South Africa does. MIT's Market Complexity Index ranks South Africa alongside countries of Southern Europe and Chile. The level of professional and financial services that operate there are similar to those in the United States. The rule of law. South Africa ranks highly in the quality of its legal system and its independence of its courts, which frequently rule against its government. South Africa's constitution is among the world's most progressive, and the quality of its bar is unrivaled in Africa. Media and thought leadership. South Africa has a robust media landscape. Its major dailies, weeklies, and online news outlets are competent, independent, and increasingly influential across the African continent. A special note needs to be made of its specialized financial and engineering media. South Africa think tanks are among the best in the African continent and aspire to have a role outside of its borders. Infrastructure. While often imperfect, South Africa offers the best and most comprehensive infrastructure on the continent. Major problems such as power outages and water supply present ongoing challenges, especially in the face of a rapidly urbanizing society. Higher standards could possibly be achieved if local operating and financial control could devolve and/or commercialization were permitted. Universities and think tank research institutions. South Africa has 5 research universities that are ranked in the Shanghai Index. These universities offer unrivaled opportunities for research collaboration with U.S. academic institutions and corporate research and development entities. Each of these qualities is discussed in greater detail in my report. Based upon the above, my report makes recommendations on how to deepen our engagement with South Africa. These are not meant to be exhaustive and but only provide a start. As in the early 1990s, South Africa is again at a moment of inflection, and the U.S. needs to ramp up its level of engagement across the spectrum of issues and stakeholders. These stakes could not be higher. A South Africa that emerges as a coherent and credible state can fulfill the needs and aspirations of its dynamic population versus one that slides into misrule, social dysfunction, kleptocracy, xenophobia, violence that will have ramifications for not only for South Africa, but for the entire continent. My recommendations, or my report's recommendations, include a robust trade engagement. South Africa is the leading beneficiary of AGOA, but that agreement legislation will expire in less than 8 years. And there's no guarantee that there will be another extension given the current climate for unilateral trade relations agreements in the United States. South Africa can help itself and the larger African continent by accelerating regional trade integration before the expiration of AGOA by negotiating a continental free trade or regional free trade agreement with the United States. An FTA would make trade relations more durable and predictable, leading to more technology transfer and foreign direct investment into an economy that can truly be the United States' gateway to Africa. Business-to-business relations. Added vigor is needed here. Upon the evolution from apartheid, the Gore and Mbeki Binational Commission and the U.S.-South Africa Business Council supplied energy and excitement. The intervening 20 years have seen a dissipation of that energy. In the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Corporate Council in Africa, and BCIU are still working to complement the efforts of the American Chamber of Commerce in South Africa to inform and advocate the interest of its members. Despite these efforts, they have been unable to spark deeper interest from the U.S. investors. First, the level of meaningful engagement with South African government is frankly lacking. Second, there could be more engagement with small and medium U.S. enterprises and investors that could be excited by the opportunities in South Africa. And third, our relations with South Africa tend to get bogged down in dialogues on conflict rather than finding and exploiting opportunities. One area of common agreement among these business entities in South Africa is the opportunity that exists for U.S. companies to transfer technology and know-how to Africa through South Africa. In this regard, the emergence of technology-focused dialogue between the two countries could be fruitful. The Global Life Sciences Organization, BIO, has reached out to South Africa and has successfully engaged its business community and technology leaders to attend their annual conference. It would seem logical to deepen that engagement and perhaps to begin focusing exchanges in such areas as health, agriculture, information and communication technologies, energy infrastructure, and financial services. This could be accomplished by holding workshops showcasing best practices in these fields and their possible applications to South Africa. As noted recently by Moletsi Mbeki at his remarks at the U.S. Institute of Peace, the U.S. is the global center of innovation. The U.S.'s venture capital, private equity, and fixed income expertise can find able counterparts in attractive projects across Africa by starting in South Africa. Government-to-government relations. Relations between the two countries have stalled, if not soured. Though it's nearly $1 billion a year of assistance, much of that to PEPFAR, and a military-to-military relationship, thought should be given to forming a new binational commission of government and business leaders. Such an undertaking could explore the emergence of an FTA, as mentioned before, with South Africa and encourage the acceleration of these regional efforts in Africa. Perhaps a timetable could be established between the two governments with input provided by business communities in each country. For example, the USTR could be guided by the collective expertise of this Trade Advisory Committee on Africa. Whitney Snideman was one of those members, as I was at the outset. The U.S. government could also adopt public diplomacy initiatives that will resonate and showcase both public and private sector programs and success stories. The USAID and its experienced Africanist head, Mark Green, will see merit in continuing U.S. development partnerships with South Africa. The Pentagon and U.S. mission to the UN can build on recent successes of the joint peacekeeping exercises between the two militaries and look for areas of collaboration. Closer and earlier diplomatic discussions in Pretoria, Washington, and New York will help identify common ground on African issues and help avoid conflicts. The FBI, TSA, and other U.S. institutions can elaborate new mechanisms for counterterrorism, illegal trade, human, wildlife, money, and drugs, and transportation safety. Last, there are myriad opportunities for collaboration among universities and think tanks. Leading research universities in the United States have ongoing activities in South Africa. A formalized dialogue between U.S. and South African universities could be evolved through such education-focused institutions as the Aspen Institute or the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. Similarly, think tanks in both countries, such as the Atlantic Council, can collaborate more deeply and in so doing better foster informed decision-making by government and business leaders. In conclusion, South Africa is an emerging economy confronting deep social challenges and divisions, but it also an oftentimes unpopular regional hegemon whose future is often more closely aligned, seemingly, with BRIC countries rather than its traditional partners such as the US. The Mandela legacy is gone, and realistic engagement on respective interests must be the compass for future engagement with South Africa. Washington and Pretoria need to achieve a state of mutual pragmatic concentration on a set of candidly proffered interests. That is the only way to create a durable platform in which to foster deeper social, academic, business, economic, and political relations. This paper provides a rough blueprint on how to build that platform, and we look forward to working with all of you to achieve that goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, for giving us that overview, and thank you for all of you for joining us today. It's my pleasure to lead and moderate this discussion on making the vision that Tony has outlined a potential reality. And to kick off our conversation, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Gips to reflect on the relationship when you were ambassador and where you think it is today and what are the obstacles in getting it to be a stronger place in the future, in the near term.
So first of all, thank you, Tony, because I do think we hopefully have an opportunity for a reset, and it's the right time to do it. And also just want to acknowledge like a bunch of people in this room who taught me everything I know about South Africa, and also Melosi from the embassy, who I think is a perfect example of promoting trade in Africa. If anyone has issues with South Africa, he's the person to go talk to. Raise your hand, Melosi. Look, it takes two to tango in a relationship. And I was fortunate to arrive at a time where President Obama had just come into office, President Zuma had recently taken office, and there was an opening for a restart to a relationship. And I think we were able to make a lot of progress, but then, to be honest, the South Africans sort of lost interest.
And why do you think that is in opposition to the BRICS kind of opportunity?
Yeah, and one thing I would say that I didn't fully understand until I got there is we think of ourselves as historical friends of South Africa, and Tony alluded to this in his report. In South Africa, they remember we were on the wrong side of the apartheid struggle. And anybody who ever forgets that doesn't understand how South Africa works, because I'll never forget my first dinner that was put on by the foreign ministry, and Foreign Minister Mashabane made a point of sitting me next to the Cuban ambassador and coming over to point out that she'd done that purposely. While I was there, they tried to change the name of the street in front of our embassy to Fidel Castro Avenue. And, you know, to understand this, and Bruce remembers this well, you know, who supported them during their struggle? And everyone in the leadership is a part of the struggle. It was Cuba, it was Russia. They ally very closely with Palestine. My first meeting with Gwede Montash the head of the ANC, I walk in and he says to me, and I was prepared to talk to him about Israel. They think Israel is an apartheid state. I was prepared to talk to him about Cuba, but he brought up Western Sahara, which I didn't actually at that point know existed. Their ideology is very much based in that history. And we have to understand that and work through that as we rebuild these relationships.
But the question is the next generation of the ANC.
So will the next generation be different? Good question. It's actually an interesting thing. If you go speak to students on the university campuses, they're more left than the current leadership. So I'm not convinced that it'll be very different. And I think it's one of the challenges we have, and we need to do a better job of being out there and telling that story. Now, I'm a Democrat, I'm an Obama appointee, so I obviously have some views, but I also think the Make America Great, America First dialogue is not helping the situation. I was just in Nigeria and meeting with the Nigerian Senate. The first question I got is, why should we work with you when you're not going to work with us? And I do think this is a challenge in doing the reset Tony's talking about. There is a huge amount of shared interest, and I think we need to figure out how to capture that.
Right.
We'll see who comes out of the conference. I think that will have for those of you who don't know, December 16th, the ANC conference starts. They'll pick a new leader of the ANC, assuming the conference goes forward, which looks more likely this week than it did last week. And the two leading candidates have fairly different philosophies around what the relationship with the United States should and could look like. So depending on whether Cyril wins or Nkosazana wins, you could have a different opportunity for this reset. And depending on who wins, just one other point on that, you'll find out whether, the likelihood of President Zuma finishing his term through 2019 is also very different and affects the opportunity for a reset.
And Rob, maybe I will jump in with you in the idea of the kind of political milieu that Ambassador Gips laid out. Within that, though, there's been a lot of opportunities historically and today for U.S. and South African companies to work together. Most American companies that have big footprints on the continent and started out having that decades ago have a footprint in South Africa, a significant one where the majority of their staff is, et cetera. How do you see the business relationship in terms of investment, capital flows, and within this political milieu, this one channel of business relationship, how do you see it growing, or what are the challenges there?
Yeah, thanks, Aubrey, and also just to echo the thanks for having me here today, expressed by the rest of the panel. I think the two words that really stood out to me in Tony's report that summarized this very well were this need for pragmatism. And I think no matter what one's political alignment, it appears that we've entered a time of interest over ideology as the US engages with the African continent. I think what the US is experiencing is that Africa made that decision quite a while back. And a lot of the trade flows and changes in trade flows towards both the BRICS and the rest of the continent are a reflection of that. I think the irony here is certainly the aspects of commerce and the private sector where the US is a thought leader are of tremendous benefit to South Africa, and I'll speak a little bit more about innovation a little later on. But with pragmatism and the rest of the continent in mind, the real tragedy for me is that South Africa hasn't yet realized that it can be the bridge to the rest of the continent, or that is of great benefit to it. And really that is because we're a plurality of people with a very different economic infrastructure in South Africa. 80% or 85% banking penetration, in contrast to ranging between 30 and 40% in some of the other global champions. Where we have seen the beginnings of exploring that relationship with the rest of the continent and the US as a partner has certainly been in financial services. That's probably the easiest place to look. At Lateral Capital, we've thought deeply about what the opportunities and challenges are over the medium to long term, over the next 2 decades, more broadly for sub-Saharan Africa. And we've summarized them really in 3 buckets of opportunity. And I think South Africa ties into this as a platform well. Firstly, commerce, which includes both financial services, but also data. There's so little practical thoughts around monetizing data and what that looks like for a continent of 1.4 billion people. The second, and the one that I get the most excited about, is what we call human capital, which really puts education and healthcare together. And there have been successes, certainly in academia, but also in the private sector, of collaboration between universities, but also digital initiatives, such as the Get Smarter initiative between the University of Cape Town and various US universities. And thirdly, what we call critical infrastructure. And I think the provision of basic services, power being the most obvious, continues to be a place where South Africa can act as that platform. South Africa arguably has one of the most advanced renewable energy programs in the world.
Yes, one of the most successful. Up to 40% of their power is generated from renewable sources, just from a procurement program that ran, what, 3 years, 4 years now?
Yeah, and also just from a $1 per kilowatt hour access cost for the continent. And really, the pragmatism that Tony highlighted, I think, needs to be led by dialogue on how South Africa can benefit from being that bridge.
Yeah, well, I mean, South Africa's been selling itself in the US market or globally as a gateway to Africa for decades. Now it has competition in that realm. Morocco is now trying to sell itself the same way. And then as the sub-regions have grown, you know, Nairobi is seen as the hub of East Africa, and West Africa is a little bit up for grabs, just because of the way aviation works in the region. And so this selling as a gateway, while it's true that the US companies were there, I mean, do you see those trends reversing? I mean, Tony, Don, I mean, did you see companies coming in right now or leaving, or is it a mixed bag in terms of US corporate presence? Yeah.
I think it's a mixed bag. At Albright, we've helped companies leave, and we're helping a major one enter right now. It really depends on what they're coming for. And I think Tony highlighted the rule of law and the way the financial system works is a key inducement for companies to come.
Quality of life and talent recruitment.
Quality of, well, so bigger challenges. You know, the education system in South Africa, while very good at the university level, is broken at the lower levels. And I think companies that need large numbers of skilled employees actually find it a challenge, combined with the visa rules, make it very difficult if you have a large workforce, which is exactly the opposite of what South Africa needs. I think the other big thing, and I've talked to every minister I can about this in South Africa, is to achieve the gateway strategy, you have to make it easy for other Africans to come into the country and work. And right now it is incredibly difficult.
Correct.
And so if you're going to have a gateway, and you know, one challenge in the gateway strategy, just like, you know, lots of Latin American companies don't like seeing Americans show up. Lots of African countries don't like seeing South Africans show up. So to have a successful gateway, you got to have people from the other countries around the continent. Right now, that's challenging to do.
Tony, do you have any reflections on the footprint right now of corporates?
You know, I mean, I think there'll always be quite a bit of variability, and companies are motivated not only by perceptions of the South African market or the African market, but they'll also be, you know, driven by their own internal strategies in terms of consolidation, expansion, whatever. You know, so I think it's hard to say that one specific example is sort of a trend. But in my report, I point out a few companies that have really seized on this notion that South Africa could very much be a gateway partner for the rest of Africa. For example, one of the companies that is doing work in Thomson Reuters in the development of new ways in which to map out urban areas. That is a technology that they've deployed in Cape Town, and see that as a technology that they're going to be able to deploy across Africa. Well, what does that do? It makes certainty of land ownership, titling, specificity of property a better and more known quantity. Therefore, people can leverage that. They can go to the bank, they can have greater certainty, they can make improvements on their property if that can happen. Pfizer's
Can I jump in on that one? Because it's a great example.
Sure.
We could not we had to fight to get the visa of the head of Thomson Reuters Africa approved. Melosi finally helped us get it resolved, but huge challenge. And this was a company, the person had already been there, set up this operation. So just wanted to.
Well, you know, sometimes the small print giveth and the small print taketh away. I mean, I think that's a Tom Waits quote, by the way. So that's high authority, indeed. Honestly, I think that is one of the things that we wrestle with, and maybe greater illumination on some of these issues, possibly with an opportunity for a new governance model in South Africa will allow us a little bit more legroom to build these type of relationships. But in the area of healthcare and health sciences, Pfizer's partnering with a South African company to do research on vaccines. South Africa has, you know, I had worked with the Mayo Clinic many years ago about the idea of developing a partnership with the Albert Lutuli Hospital in KwaZulu-Natal. The idea that they were so excited about because they wanted to build a bioinformatics system to administer and govern the issuance of antiretrovirals in KwaZulu-Natal, which, as many of you know, is the center of HIV incidence in South Africa. And when you talk to their practitioners in Rochester, Minnesota, about the opportunities of doing collaboration in such hospitals as Albert Lutuli, Baragwanath in Johannesburg, Tygerberg in Cape Town, they were excited because there are just a lot of clinical opportunities that they don't often see in the United States. And so I think that there are opportunities in the health sciences that I think could be benefit partners on both sides. And I think it's really, an opportunity for us to push that.
The question is, are these niche or are they systemic in a way? Because, you know, a lot of these types of partnerships aren't job creating in mass, to your point, Ambassador. And one of the challenges that I've always seen in South Africa, and I don't see any change of this happening in the future, is a rigid labor market. It's hard to hire and fire people when you need to create jobs. And, you know, with a government where the other parts of it are a labor union that is representing government workers, basically, COSATU, and then the Communist Party, you basically have a situation that's a very pro-labor perspective, but that may not be a pro-job creation one. And if you combine that with the saddest part of the kind of post-Mandela era, which is a failure of primary education and all the scandals that happened around education challenges. I mean, how do you marry that with a future where you need to create a lot of jobs? It's a very different strategy than, say, in Ethiopia is taking to create jobs, which is, you know, light manufacturing, low wages at the beginning, very a la Asia in a job creation perspective. You know, South Africa has to find a middle road that's probably more technological and more innovation oriented, like a US or an entrepreneurship. And what is the status of entrepreneurship, Rob? I mean, do you feel that that is a job-creating engine for South Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Aubrey. I think you've touched on some of the core ingredients, but one thing that I want to highlight that you alluded to that we haven't really spoken about openly is the importance of the informal sector in the South African economy. In many developed nations, the informal economy or SMEs constitute up to 60% of GDP, and South Africa is no different. When you look at the causes for a lot of the challenges that you've described, I think there are technology solutions to bringing the informal economy into the rest of the financial services infrastructure. Education should not be taken lightly, and Ambassador was absolutely right. You know, tertiary education, while we do have 5 universities, research universities in the Shanghai Index, we have just recently really struggled with the human capital side of acquiring skill sets, and seen a great contrast between Lagos and Nairobi, which are the 2 other hubs of our strategy at the secondary education level. But in terms of remedies, technology does have a place. I think some of the challenges that technology needs to solve as well are the social welfare dependency that's been created in South Africa.
Yes.
It might have been cited as a positive statistic in the report that we've gone from 4 million citizens to 17 million dependent on social welfare, but that actually is also imprisoning in many ways. And
from a mindset perspective.
And those resources deployed to education and the empowering element of education, I think, would be far more productive.
And just to throw out one statistic to add to that, 17 million social grant recipients, 6 million individual taxpayers. shows you how out of whack.
The math can't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the innovations that can help solve some of these problems are a much lower cost of education and financial inclusion for SMEs.
And do we see that for a while there was a period where South African companies, this is before the crash of the Rand, but South African companies were investing in the US. Sasol, Naspers was looking. Do we still see that today as South African companies become more global, or have they retrenched in this low growth period and low Rand period?
There's actually a term which has been coined in the venture capital community that South Africa is often associated with, which is called Africa out. People get so excited that you're exporting technology from Africa to the other developed economies. It's oftentimes not just the US, but we find South African founders that think of their second or third markets to be in Eastern Europe or Australasia, and I'm not sure that you can make a normative judgment as to whether that's a good or a bad thing. We very clearly see a long-term benefit to the rest of Africa being the play. I think that South Africa still recognizes the intellectual and innovation prowess that the US has developed on the West Coast. It is just the case that sometimes the practical applications of what's developed in Silicon Valley or on the East Coast don't solve for the problems of the use cases.
Sure.
Can I,
Yeah.
I always have to put in a plug for Nando's. So,
Yeah.
but there are
We all
many
love
South
Nando's.
African companies that actually are coming
Yeah.
outside of South Africa, some to Africa, but surprisingly large number investing in the U.S. And I actually think that's speeding up, not
Yeah,
slowing down.
I know folks who are trying to rescue the West Virginia coal industry with South African investment, basically, into coal in West Virginia.
Oceana's doing fish stuff here, fish canning and processing. Safe Light, the auto glass, is a South African company.
Yeah.
So there are a bunch that are here.
And I think what that is reflecting is, there's this constant debate in the Africa business world is, is South Africa a bigger economy or is Nigeria a bigger economy? And it depends on who you're talking with. But one of the things that I think it's important to remember and reflects the importance of this conversation is that if you look at the McKinsey report on African companies, the corporate concentration in South Africa is unmatched. There are 400 African companies with more than $1 billion in revenue, and over 300 of them are based in South Africa. So when you think of it from that perspective, you have a huge world of not only corporate activity, but banks, advisors, the intermediation, the risk, all the different, if you look at EY, PwC, big companies in the kind of business services space, all their concentration of employees in South Africa is enormous. And it's because of this kind of universe of corporate concentration that's very important to think about when weighing their relative economic power in the region.
Thanks to the Guptas, a few of them may be shrinking. But,
Correct, or at least fined, et cetera.
But just on that point, Aubrey, I think it's important to distinguish between the absolute number of companies or the presence and the actual contribution to growth and to the to GDP in the private sector. And we ran a quick exercise looking at if you dissect the private sector more broadly in all the BRICS, it's comprised of 16.7 million companies, of which 99.5% generate revenues of less than $5 million annually.
Yeah.
So the opportunity set really is not the absolute number of companies that are present, but addressing that massive tail of small companies.
Yes.
And there, I think Nigeria and Kenya certainly have captured the imagination of US capital more creatively.
True, and I think that also reflects, that imbalance also reflects the gross inequality that plagues South Africa. You can read a variety of statistics on, 3 men having more wealth in South Africa than huge percentage of the population. And so that inequality, I think, is a burden going into the future. Tony, I would like to end with you, and then we'll turn to questions. Given this, the commercial, we've kind of zoomed in on the business landscape. How do you think companies and those in the investment space can be helpful in driving a better U.S.-South Africa relationship?
Well, thank you. Firstly, I think that we've not done enough in creating sort of mutually beneficial relationships with our South African business counterparts. You know, I think South Africa's been mired in its own drama and business organizations and
The BUSA and all of the
exactly.
changes.
And you know, not that we necessarily have a dog in that fight, but I think we could do a lot more in reaching out and creating linkages with these business organizations. I was honored to serve with Dan O'Flaherty on the U.S. South Africa Business Council for a number of years, which was a very active environment and venue for these type of discussions and engagements. And I think we could do more, have more ambition in terms of our linkages with these business associations.
And maybe a sectoral approach.
And a sectoral approach.
I mean,
Could be
you've done that in
infrastructure,
mining.
health sciences, bio, mining. I mean, the mining sector in South Africa is pretty static, and that would probably be a generous statement right now. There has not been a lot of new investment, in fact, hardly any new investment in the mining sector, and yet South Africa, on almost any measure, probably still has in the ground more mineral resources than any country in the world, with maybe the exception of Russia. But I mean, there's vast quantities of still commercially quantifiable minerals that could be extracted, but right now, the mining sector has been really mired in this debate on what the new mining legislation is going to look like. So I think that's an area where we could get some rapid progress if that were to move in the right direction.
So let's take some questions now. I know many of you have deep roots in this discussion, and I would like to invite you want to say a couple of things from the embassy perspective? You have a mic right here if you'd like to, and then we'll turn to questions here.
No, thank you and good morning. I think my intention was not to say anything, but since you have offered, I think I must say and appreciate and thank you, Tony, and Rob, and also Ambassador for the kind comments and also the proposals on how we can reset the relationship. I think what we have seen lately, I think confirms what Tony has been saying. We've seen a number of U.S. technology companies partnering with South African companies. We have a company in Chicago which has a technology which can harvest the CO2 emissions in Mpumalanga from the coal mining for better use in the industry. So we are seeing a number of those kind of win-win relationship between U.S. and South African companies. And I think we, as Ambassador Gibbs have said, we continue to see an increasing number of South African companies investing in the U.S. We have Steinhoff, which has just bought Mattress Pham. We have Sibanye Gold, which has just partnered with or bought the Stillwater mine in Colorado. We have a number of these examples where South Africa is making. And increasingly, we have an increasing number of U.S. companies setting shop. I think Whitney's here is one of those who have now setting offices in South Africa. That shows the increasing opportunities which U.S. companies continue to see in South Africa. But I think we can do more. We can do more. And one question which I had, which I wanted to also address, I think if you look at, I think Tony has talked to a length about AGOA and maybe 2015. I think those discussions are continuing to take place. But what I could like to indicate is if you look at the AGOA utilization, from South Africa to even Ethiopia or other countries, our utilization of AGOA preferences are very, very low. Yeah. For South Africa, for AGOA, we are only utilizing less than 115 GSP, something like around 400. What it means is that, well, there are opportunities. Probably we need more investment in order for us to take advantage of those. Hence, in terms of the regional integration, we are talking about industrialization, investment infrastructure to enable us to do. So I would like to get some of your thoughts on how we can better encourage U.S. companies to locate in South Africa, in Africa, in order to take advantage of these opportunities which AGOA has opened, and even South Africa in terms of the partnerships we have with the European Union have opened. Because when you locate in South Africa, the market is not only in terms of the US, but you can access the EU, can access the Mercosur market and so on. So I think I could like to get some of your ideas in terms of how we can unlock those investment. Thank you.
We'll take a series of other questions, and right here and right here. We'll go right here first, and then Judy. Please identify yourself and your affiliation.
All right. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, and it was so terrific panel. My name is Daewon. I work as a Manchester Trade Research intern. I was wondering that what could the U.S. make of the China's surging interest in South Africa?
China, okay.
And I was wondering that would you view China as a competitor, or would you view it as the economic partner in terms of the U.S.-South Africa relation? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go with Judy here. Judy, go ahead.
Hello, and thank you for your excellent presentation. My name is Judy Etundi, and I work as a consultant for FDI to Africa, specialized with Cameroon at the moment. I very much wanted to follow up on the pragmatism talked about by Mr. Eloff. Two quick remarks. The first one, South Africa as a gateway to Africa. Is that perception still accurate? At a moment where most African countries are developing their autonomous and direct trade and business relationships, not only with China, but also with the United States and independently with the EU. So, and would it not be more helpful to view South Africa as its own thing, basically, as an emerging market with its specificity and its own relationships with not only Africa but also Europe, Asia, just like we do with other countries. Which leads me to my second remark. The specificities of South Africa are enormous, especially with regard to their historical legacies. There's a very sophisticated, internationalized, advanced South African economy, and there's one that is less so, and that one is, well, again, historical legacies, more black, more diverse, etc. So perhaps one of the areas to advance U.S. interests and U.S. influence and U.S. business is to concentrate more specifically on that sector that is not as advanced and focus education, technology, etc., to that sector, especially at a time where private businesses like the Chinese, but not just the Chinese, the Indians and others are focusing on that sector. So maybe that's part of the solution.
So we'll take this round here, and while other of you think of questions, Tony, I'll turn to you on AGOA. You know, one of the things that I think has been difficult for all of us who have been working in this space for a long time was the breakdown of the U.S. South Africa free trade, conversations that happened 10 years ago. We're still living through that, and then the kind of controversies around AGOA and chicken and all of that we went through. Now the question is, can South Africa use AGOA in this 8-year period? And is it realistic to expect them to use some of the same tariff lines that like the light manufacturers will use, like apparel? I don't see a lot of apparel coming out of South Africa to the U.S. anytime soon.
Well, thank you for your comments. And truly, those of us who were involved, and many of the people in this room were involved in the sort of design and inception and energizing behind the passage of AGOA, were more hopeful that the results would have been higher and more dramatic than they've been. I think we underestimated the supply response in Africa and the challenges in integrating Africa into global value chains, which is, of course, now the method and means in which global manufacturing is undertaken. South Africa only uses 140 of the categories of 6,400 categories available under AGOA and GSP, but that's probably 139 more than many other African countries have been able to utilize. So while 140 doesn't seem like a lot versus 6,400, it does seem a lot when compared to a measure of 1 or 2. So South Africa certainly should not be satisfied by the progress that has been achieved in AGOA in the last 17 years. But let me point out a couple of data points that I think are useful. When we first went into South Africa, to sort of inform and excite about the prospects of taking advantage of this legislation, South Africa exported virtually no oranges to the United States. Now it's the largest supplier of whole oranges into the United States market.
And how did that change, Tony? Like, what made the big difference there? Do you
Well, I think it was first of all, the South Africans organized themselves. Their Citrus Industry Association was very, in fact, we see them often now still to this day working the halls of Congress and working on relationships. They were very organized. They were very able to sort of see what the opportunity was and to invest in the refrigeration and delivery and growth and meet the U.S. quality standards, which are extraordinarily specific and demanding. So that was one example. Another is if you drive a BMW 3 Series automobile in this market, that car was made in South Africa, and that car is South Africa because South Africa had the ability of integrating the 3 tiers of suppliers necessary to make an OEM
and
vehicle.
it's a good example because your question said how can U.S. companies invest to make more trade. The issue is they don't have to be U.S. companies to invest.
That's right.
BMW is a good example. And then many of the early apparel, for example, the Ethiopian apparel industry is with Chinese investment, but it's coming in under AGOA. So the investor doesn't have to be American in that perspective.
And let me point out, and just quickly on the comment that I think was directed to me about South Africa, a gateway and an emerging market. Well, it can be both. In South Africa, as I think Moletsi Mbeki talked about in his recent visit here, that South Africa doesn't always see itself in alignment with other African countries. It sees itself as a distinct emerging economy that ought to be viewed versus Chile and versus Southern European countries and not necessarily versus Cameroon, with all due respect to Cameroon. I just think it can be both. And if you look at what I find, and some of those who follow trade statistics over the last few years find particularly compelling about South Africa is that the rest of Africa's exports into Africa are roughly about 10 or 12%. Mostly it's export of unprocessed and unrefined commodities, mineral, agriculture, and what have you, outside into other markets. South Africa's trade with Africa is about 33%. It's hard to see, it's hard to measure SACU because it's a customs union, so it's hard to see exactly chart what the trades are from South Africa into the SACU countries. But those goods are not commodities. Those are manufactured products. They're consumer goods, they're chemicals, there is machinery and equipment, stuff that South Africa has ability of being able to access the value chains necessary to produce these sophisticated products and goods. So, okay, a lot more can be done and more will be done, but the 2 points to leave is that it isn't always going to be U.S. that are going to be invest to take advantage of AGOA. It's going to be other investors. But South Africa can be a platform for not only exporting to the United States, but exporting into the rest of Africa, as we've seen in the last few years of trade data.
Ambassador Gibbs, I'll turn to you on the future of the AGOA relationship. We think there will be a free trade agreement because there are many efforts to kick out South Africa from AGOA, saying it's graduated. And then also, if you can comment on the China question and how, are you hearing U.S. companies complaining about China and South Africa, or do they see it as a place where maybe U.S. and China could collaborate in an interesting way?
So let me actually first take off on the AGOA point.
Yeah.
And I think it's related, but a little different. South Africa's economy, last time I checked, is the size of the state of Maryland. Its economy, it's just not that big. And freeing up the African market is what will attract much more American investment, Chinese investment. The only way to do that is to create intra-Africa trade agreements. And if you want to locate a manufacturing facility in Nigeria, it needs to be treated as located in South Africa and vice versa.
And we're very far from that day.
And we're very far from that day. But without that, the potential of Africa is not going to be realized. And if I were at USTR and trying to figure out how to promote both development of Africa and America's interest at the same time, I would be focusing on using every tool to help create an intra-Africa trade agreement that realizes the full potential of the African economy. Stepping back from that, the problem with striking an individual free trade agreement with South Africa right now is South Africa's got a lot of problems. And they got 10 years under AGOA. It's very hard to get anybody's attention at this point. We'll see what happens when whoever the new ANC leader is, and that may lead to a different outcome, but pretty hard to predict, sitting where we are today, that it's going to be number one on anybody's list of things to renegotiate right now.
Not necessarily renegotiate now, but the idea is that post this round of AGOA, there will be some other treatment of South Africa. I think most people agreed with that at 2015.
Totally agree. But my perspective on it would be, if I were at USTR, to figure out how to make it about Africa, not about South Africa. The China question is probably the question I got asked most while I was ambassador, and I actually think—
Asked by whom?
everybody. And it's interesting because I think the real challenge is less in South Africa and on the rest of the continent. And I think the Chinese have been a major competitor for South African companies trying to go to the rest of the continent. You talk to the mining companies about the number of leases that are getting bought up, particularly the second and third tier leases. They say they can't compete. You talk to the construction companies, the logistic companies. Those were areas where South Africa used to excel on the continent, and they're now losing to the Chinese. In South Africa itself, a little bit less of a challenge. And, you know, partially because it's not easy for the Chinese to do business there either.
Yeah.
The Chinese ambassador, when I was ambassador, his son and my son were best friends, so we used to hang out together at family dinners and school events. And he would complain all the time about how difficult it was to do business for him in South Africa.
So equal opportunity, bureaucratic challenges.
You know, when BBBEE is applied, it's applied to everybody, and it's a complicated set of rules.
Yeah.
Visa rules are applied to everybody.
Sure.
So, in some ways, the challenges that American businesses face have also hit on the Chinese.
Rob, maybe you can address Judy's point about how do you engage the smaller businesses in South Africa, and this question of, you know, do we see South Africa as a gateway, or do we see them as an investor in the rest of Africa? If you look at the stats from a few years ago, EY, et cetera, South Africa is one of the largest investors in the rest of Africa. So changing that perception may help in the other countries.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll start with the second question first. And I very much share a lot of the sentiment around the specificity of South Africa, and sometimes, certainly in the venture capital community, there's a bit of a struggle to see over Table Mountain and understand what the rest of the continent looks like. I would say my desire for South Africa to better engage the rest of the continent is selfish, and that I want South Africa to realize how big that opportunity is. As an investor and as a fiduciary, we've massively overweighted places like, and I won't even say countries, because we look at the continent in cities, places like Lagos and Nairobi for scale. I think the practical reasons why South Africa does continue to offer advantages for foreign capital in engaging with the rest of the continent are certainly the rule of law. There's very, very strong protections for minorities in South Africa that the private sector has benefited from for a long time. Secondly, the access to capital. While the cost of capital is not always something that Western investors would be comfortable with, it's very much more palatable than in other places. And I think sort of the skill sets around the financial services industry. For me, one of the sort of easy wins that I would love to see investigated to answer this question, and Mo Ibrahim has probably been the best champion for regionalization on the African continent, is when African pension funds will explore the opportunity of investing in their own and in each other's markets. And the US has a great role to play there. Last year there was investment from the New York State Pension Fund that I think overshadowed all intra-African pension fund investment for the last 50 years. And the asset liability sort of mismatch in African countries would solve a lot of problems. And I think South Africa, you know, does have a very sophisticated pension industry led by the PIC. So there is just some practical reasons.
And not only a sophisticated industry, but there was a mindset because of the sanctions during apartheid that they had to use their own capital locally. Sure. And because of that, you do see South African pensions and funds investing locally and fueling an industry, whereas like Nigerian pension funds can invest 5% of their money in private equity or alternative vehicles, and they don't even they're less than 0.5%.
Exactly.
And so they could use that expertise out of South Africa in many ways.
But it's got to come with a mindset of, it's not about exporting how things are done in South Africa, it's trying to find the right combination of skills that exist in South Africa and the opportunity in the rest of the continent.
Let me take another round of questions, but go ahead.
For those of you who didn't see, KKR announced yesterday or this week that they're shutting down their Africa operation. And I think the point that Rob made on mismatch of tenure
Size,
is key, and it's really important for African pension funds to enter this market so that, and invest through people like him, so that tenure issue gets solved and the flows start coming.
Yeah.
I think that will also give U.S. private capital confidence that there'll be long-term exits if they see these pension
Yeah, there's
funds
got to be the
investing.
missing middle that's addressed, like what Judy was saying about all the smaller companies. They have to grow to be KKR sized, right?
Just a final point on that. I think South Africa needs to perhaps step up and show the leadership in the area of particularly we're talking about pension funds. Last year, Aubrey was kind enough to speak at a conference that I helped organize on the African capital markets. And I think that the South Africans still tend to be very myopic in viewing their market as sort of the end of the sort of terra firma. It ends at the Zimbabwean border, and that they don't really see the need to get beyond that. I think South Africans have a leadership opportunity to step forward and really organize such areas as pension funds for the rest of the continent.
But it's got to come from a position of listening and engaging rather than
Telling.
dictating the rules of engagement.
That's right.
Please, we have a question here. We have 2 questions back here, so we'll take this last round. Dan.
Thank you, Audrey. And thank you, Tony, for a splendid report and a good discussion. But sitting here listening
Dan, can you tell everyone in the room?
Oh, I'm Dan O'Flaherty. I used to run the U.S. South Africa Business
Yes.
Council at the time when we had the unsuccessful negotiation for a free trade agreement with SACU.
Yeah.
Couldn't help wondering if anyone on the panel can enlighten us as to what the Trump administration's policy towards South Africa is.
Okay, let's take the questions back here. These 2.
Good morning. My name is Ngozi Burrell. I'm a project assistant at the National Democratic Institute. And my question is in regards to Rob's comment on just essentially investing and listening and engagement in South Africa in terms of what small business enterprises need. I've been doing a lot of research in terms of the unemployment rate. As we all know, it's one of the highest in the world, about 28%. And I think that also your comments on secondary education is essential to kind of bring to the table in terms of how to invest more in South Africa. Just going off of that, what do you think are specific ways that the U.S. can help transition from the secondary education improvement to tertiary and increasing more opportunities for actual South Africans to participate in these trade agreements? Thank you.
I'm David Smith of The Guardian. Actually, just building on the first question, just interested in your thoughts on, for example, what message is it sending that there is still not a US ambassador to South Africa? And also be interested looking at Africa more generally. For example, Ambassador Gibbs, you mentioned you went to Nigeria. What sense do you get of how people there and other parts of the continent, how do they view President Trump?
So we'll take this round and close out. Before jumping into Trump policy, let's, Rob, have you answer kind of the question about engaging the unemployed or what to do about unemployment in South Africa.
I'm so relieved I'm getting that question, Aubrey, because I absolutely would not know where to start with the Trump policies to Africa. So just coming up with some practical solutions to the sticky unemployment and innovation and SMEs. I think maybe the best way to answer the question is to offer some examples of where things have worked well and where the US has played an interesting role. One of the most interesting adaptations of US innovation that I've seen with regard to SMEs was this model that a company here in the US called Square pioneered of enabling merchant payments without a very costly hardware device off a tablet or even a smartphone. And a company in South Africa has built a similar offering, which really the end result allows lending to SME businesses. And the innovation,
credit records and
the innovation there really is data capture, because you enable a financial services company to have real-time cash flow data on every single transaction that a small merchant makes. There's no better set of there's no better data set to provide credit origination and lend to someone that would traditionally be outside of the financial services industry. A bank is unlikely to lend to a business like that. And that sort of manner of thinking of if it's a problem of accessing credit, are we going about assessing credit the right way? And how can we do that in 2017? Not the way we did in 1970, where if you don't have a utility bill, you don't get banked. Education is slightly trickier, and the reason why is because it's not clear exactly where the private sector and the public sector should step up first. And I think this cannot be done without the public sector. If you look at successful innovation in this country, it's tended to emerge at the triangulation of academia, government, and the private sector. We have seen some success in digital content distribution. I think the problem for investors is it remains challenging to generate high returns on those types of investments because they're really solving grassroots problems. And the impact investment community's done somewhat of a good job there. But I
you
think
get in this murky space of mentality because you see, for example, in healthcare across the continent, people will say, oh, well, people shouldn't profit off of sick people, and they don't want to see private sector in healthcare, but yet 60% of Africans pay for healthcare out of their pocket, and so it is a private sector endeavor. And you see the same thing in education, is where, who owns the burden of educating, and should companies be generating a profit, educating the future? And if so, then what curriculum and all of that? You see it playing out with Bridge Academies in Liberia and other places.
Exactly.
So it's really a difficult place. And I find that in South Africa, in particular, sometimes there's kind of a statist view that it needs to be delivered by the state.
But the easy solutions there, for example, are teacher training, where we found some interesting innovations around rapidly providing the right skill sets to roll out the number of teachers that we need in not just South Africa, but the rest of the continent. And then lastly, healthcare has come up a number of times. And I think, when you see something enough times over a short period of time, you realize that it's a trend. And we see a massive focus on healthcare now. And the statistic that always captures my imagination is in the US, around 82% of primary care is provided through daycare centers same day. In South Africa, I believe that statistic is as low as 12%. Wow. And the ability to roll out primary healthcare strategies and initiatives like my wife is actually completing a doctoral degree in nursing practice here in the US. That's a great way to debottleneck healthcare provision, because a lot of the services that the nursing industry could provide in Africa,
the de-skilling effort,
don't require a specialist. And I think engaging with the US DNP program for Africa would reap some really interesting results.
Great.
Just one other on that. The most impressive organization I've seen at job training in South Africa is a group called Hruby that Yellowwoods funds, and is doing a fabulous job of helping people make that transition into the formal economy.
Tony, you want to speak?
I want to talk a little bit about the unemployment issue. Unemployment is not only exclusively to South Africa, it's a challenge across the globe. Everywhere you go, Latin America, Asia, where are we going to get the jobs, unemployment levels? And the fourth industrial revolution is going to create a lot of challenges in how we have traditionally been able to define what jobs are. I think South Africa, recent EY report that I cite in my study, that says that 4 out of 5 jobs in South Africa are going to come from the small and medium enterprises, not going to come from large enterprises. South Africa is still challenged at the small enterprise level by a bunch of institutional factors. Access to capital. The banks have not traditionally known how to operate in this space, and they've never been structured to do so. They enjoy high rates, service fees for their lending activities, which are uneconomic for the small and medium-sized enterprises. Data costs for small enterprises in South Africa, for all enterprises in South Africa, are exorbitantly high. There hasn't been enough competition in this space. Recently saw a statistic that the data costs in South Africa are 10 times higher than they are in the UK. This is an area that if you want to integrate small and medium enterprises into global value chains, you're going to have to reduce the rates of which. And lastly, Jack Ma was recently in New York, and he's been enlisted by UNCTAD to be a special ambassador for SMEs. And the idea there is to use technology, the power of technology, as Rob said, to integrate small and medium enterprises into global value chains is a vision that he is going to now take on. And a more energetic and innovative and creative business person I can't think of than Jack Ma. So I think South Africa needs to probably unleash the real opportunities and powers of its small enterprises to really achieve business growth, enterprise growth, and employment is going to be critical.
So let's turn to the Trump policy question. I don't think any of us on this panel know the answer, but we can at least hypothesize from being somewhat inside, but not inside the administration. So, Ambassador, would you like to say a couple
I'm definitely not inside the administration.
Well, you can see it from here.
Yep.
Look, first of all, you know, and sadly, it may be a comment on how important ambassadors are, but there is no name for South Africa that has come forward. There's some people on this panel who would be very good ambassadors.
Yes, we've
but,
all.
So far, the administration has not picked one, which I think is.
And we also don't have an assistant secretary for Africa.
We have now, having served as ambassador and having been a political appointee, so coming in from the outside, one of the things you do learn is the State Department is built to function independent of whether the political leadership are there, and they're quite capable of running it. And Jessie Pham, who's the current chargé, is fantastic and would be a great ambassador if she were given that title as well. So the State Department will keep functioning. What they need is direction. And they need direction on Africa, they need direction on South Africa. And as far as I can tell, that hasn't happened. I think the event that was just done in Washington with 34 or 37, I can't remember. Ministers, although it was too late notice, so most ministers didn't make it. But at least it was a start, and everything I've heard about that session was that it was a listening session. More than a policy was not laid out, but there was a lot of questions about what should our policy be. I would have hoped they would have asked those earlier, but it's a good start that they're asking.
Tony, would you like to comment at all on this?
I would just echo Don's comments that we have a permanent structure that is in place, that is administrating our relationship with South Africa ably, staffed by professionals who know their job and know the country, and they're doing a good job. We have, I think, seen an early statements from the administration supporting its ongoing health programs, particularly PEPFAR, which South Africa is the largest beneficiary of, and that's certainly a very strong statement that our engagement in the health space is going to continue. We've seen some cooperation in the military-to-military front in recent training exercises. TSA has a large operation in South Africa, particularly at Oliver Tambo Airport. So we enjoy some robust sort of agency-level relations that I think will continue. I think that, and obviously I'm not uninterested in this situation, but let me say this, that having viewed and witnessed operations in diplomacy for a long time, I think an ambassador rank is going to get you a lot more access and a lot more attention than an acting or DCM. Not to say that those people aren't very able. Sure. I just think that in South Africa particularly, where frankly protocol is an extraordinarily touchy subject. And you know, sometimes it takes up more energy and space and time to deal with the protocol issues than it does the substance. And is that an evasion tactic? Sometimes it is. But sometimes, you know, they are very sensitive to the notion of protocol, as they should be. But therefore, having an ambassador to come in and talk to the minister, talk to agency heads, is going to give you a lot more access. Then not any comment whatsoever upon the qualities and capabilities of those people who are acting in that position. Yeah. I just think that ambassador rank is just going to give you a lot more time and attention in South Africa.
A couple things on that. I don't think a lack of ambassadors sending a message to South Africa. I think it's part of a systemic aspect of the Trump administration not filling certain roles. But we do see a couple other things that we can see emerging. One is that there's a focus on women and women within OPIC. OPIC is launching a new women's fund. Well, 250 million, 150 that's going to Latin America, but 100 will go to women-owned, women-targeted funds and companies. So that might be an avenue for some relationships with South Africa. I know a couple of very interesting funds run by women out of South Africa. And then also, this going back to something Rob said earlier, interest over ideology. You certainly saw from Trump's remarks at the UN that some of his friends are getting rich in Africa, that there is a perspective of business and interest over ideology. So
of course, he created a new country in those same remarks.
True.
That being Nambia, which Hagi Geingob said that's okay. People mispronounce it all the time. I thought it was a great response from
exactly.
Hagi.
So you do see kind of maybe the emergence of a more commercial-friendly approach, but without the people in place, it's hard to know. So.
Look, and just one we did forget. Nikki Haley has actually
she went.
visited the continent. I think has taken a real interest in the issues there, and I think has actually been more at the forefront of thinking about.
And we have a Secretary of State that's done more business in South Africa than any other, or in Africa, excuse me, in Africa overall than any other secretary before. So you do have an awareness of the continent from a business perspective. So you have some of the ingredients that would lead for a more robust commercial partnership. It just hasn't been stirred and executed in the right way yet that we've seen. So with that, join me in thanking the panel today, and I thank all of you for coming.